Black Republic Media, a sovereign narrative, a mighty race.
I'm Denise Young with Black Republic Media. In his 1999 HBO special, Bigger and Blacker, Chris Rock, around the 44-minute mark, paces, stops center stage, and delivers, quote, "I ain't never been in the barbershop and heard a bunch of brothers talking about Jews. Black people don't hate Jews. Black people hate white people. We don't have time to dice white people up into little groups." End quote. The joke is cerebral, though Rock's delivery solicits the ha-ha rather than the aha. Had the joke been allowed to breathe like a just uncorked bottle of wine, its complexities would have unfurled. Instead, Rock capped the joke with a funny but benign follow-up. Black people, generally speaking, do not hate white people. There are still too many white Jesuses hanging in black folks' dining rooms and adorned in black churches, unbridled forgiveness granted to white murderers of black bodies 7 minutes after their capture, investment of hope in yet another initiative whose underlying purpose is to persuade white folks that we are human and that they should like us, wholesale acceptance of representation, performative acts, and token gestures that pacify us emotionally rather than dispense tangible justice, and easy passes handed to passable white entertainers who want our rhythm but not our blues, for anyone to really think that black people hate white people. I am not criticizing us. I am observing what may reflect Dr. Cleo Monago's description of the trauma trans black folks endure, quote, "when you are living in a society that literally is against your power, against your self-love," end quote. Black folk want so badly for this country to turn itself around and recognize who we are versus who it concocted us to be, to hide its origin as terrorists and hijackers of land and labor. As one still studying history, I am unable to draw any evidence that suggests we are a hating people. As my fellow Black Republic Media colleague, John Jeter, offers, quote, "Some say we don't hate white people enough," end quote. So no, Rock's joke is not about us hating white people. The punchline is us knowing who hates us, participating in and benefiting from our oppression. Everyone who accesses whiteness via the construct of whiteness. And that includes Jews. That also includes Asians and Pacific Islanders, Hispanics, Latinos. Within these U.S. borders, white systems and institutions extend the hand of whiteness to almost any group willing to assimilate and slap the face of blackness after it snatches the bread from our lips. In recent weeks, Kanye West and Kyrie Irving have been accused of anti-Semitism, preceded in the recent past by accusations of anti-Semitism hurled against Whoopi Goldberg, Nick Cannon, Mark Lamont Hill, Lupe Fiasco, and Ice Cube. Kanye's comments are problematic and jarring, and that's only part of the issue with this controversy. His comment about Hitler and the Nazis is rightly considered despicable, but if white America, especially white liberals, and Jews, liberal or not, can't denounce the Nazis who preceded Hitler for 3 centuries on this continent, beginning with the shipping magnates, all the white settlers who squatted on land and committed mass murder to keep it, plantation death camp owners, and all founding fathers, then the controversy is simply about a black man that went rogue without white permission. Irami Osei Frimpong, PhD philosophy student at the University of Georgia and podcast host of The Funky Academic, brilliantly explains, quote, "This idea that genocide is a uniquely German thing kind of degrades both the pre-genocidal impetus that was in America that gave Hitler the kind of ideas and mechanisms to codify the degradation, and also degrades the abject atrocities that were chattel slavery. And what that means is that Black people in the United States now are mandated to learn that awful white genocidal maniacs have both sides. That's a dance that white folks make Black folks dance. There are two sides to the situation. Black people are forced to participate in rituals that honor white genocidal maniacs. End quote. The specific white genocidal maniac that Osei Frimpong speaks about in this quote is Andrew Jackson, one of America's most celebrated war heroes and the 7th U.S. president. The horribly monstrous Jackson committed many gruesome crimes against Black and Indigenous humanity, including bombing a compound of 300 escaped slaves and freedmen, African men, women, and children, in Spanish Florida because the Seminoles refused to return them to the United States. Jackson, whose likeness is imprinted on the In God We Trust laden $20 bill, was so revered that a historically Black university was named in his honor. God only knows how many Black students have been forced to regard Jackson as not all bad, even though he took pleasure in exterminating their ancestors. Here's the deal, and what the white settler is worried about. Kanye verbalized finding redeeming qualities in Hitler. What he did not verbalize, but certainly is silent text after an invisible ellipsis, is that of course he can find redeeming qualities in Hitler, because the United States obliges Black people to find white genocidal maniacs redeeming. The caveat is that we are not supposed to judge them as white genocidal maniacs or white CEOs of death camps and pedophile and sex trafficking enterprises, as in the case of Thomas Jefferson and countless others. Whatever we as Black folks think about Ye, and there's a lot to untangle, it does not nullify the hypocrisy of America's moral superiority, nor the ability of white proxies to adopt the same moral superiority when convenient. Kyrie's simple act of tweeting the link to the title of a movie determined to be anti-Semitic received more backlash from the Jewish community than Jeff Bezos' offering and profiting from the sale of the movie via Amazon, his platform. Someone posted on social media that Bezos' money allows him to be able to weather any storm. I quickly responded that the point is that it didn't even drizzle in his region. Certainly his money can work to pardon him from almost any situation, but Bezos' status as a capitalist and an unfathomably rich white man is what safeguarded him from having to write a check, unlike Kyrie. Can you stand the rain? Bezos' POV. What rain? But Kyrie endured what has been described on social media as corporate buck-breaking. The list of things that Kyrie was mandated to do to continue his NBA career was so unreal that it provoked a meme in which the checklist of must-dos included admitting that raisins and potato salad are delicious. It's a joke, but not one meant to elicit a laugh, but to highlight the ease with which the white settler and his proxies hand out racialized and cultural violations for Black folks, and in particular, Black men. Infantilizing and punishing Black men are codified in this nation. In addition, consider that this buck-breaking may not be entirely about his tweeting a link to a movie. During the pandemic, Kyrie went off the liberal script, refusing to get the COVID vaccine, mandating him to miss some games. He didn't acquiesce, even with Kevin Durant's being sidelined with an injury. As with Kanye, whatever our personal opinions are about the pandemic and the vaccine, or whether we subscribe to the premise of the movie, none of it nullifies that the white man walked and the Black man got stalked. It appears that Black folks who are highly visible and more often charged with anti-Semitism toil in media, entertainment, sports, and academia. Ironically, or not, These are all industries that systemically control the narrative of Black people by reinforcing anti-Black racism, propagating Black death, degeneracy, and destruction, and straining Black freedom to a fiberless state of contentment with assimilation, filtered via white appeasement. These industries exploit Black talent and labor, making billions off Black bodies and increasing white generational wealth. Our living conditions, poverty, and degradation serve as muse for their next great story of Black victimization and white saviordom. They normalize and celebrate pathology and pass it to our children, packaged as family-friendly television or as a dope beat backing up misogynistic and misandrous lyrics. Fact: these industries are largely occupied by Jews. For instance, Jews own 30% of NFL and NBA teams. 25% of professors at Ivy League schools are Jewish. In entertainment, 20% of studio executives, managers, and talent agents are Jewish. Those percentages are disproportionate to the 2.4% Jewish population in the United States. And the percentages surpass the percentages of Black counterparts, if there are any, in these industries, particularly given that the Black population is almost 7 times that of the Jewish population at 14%. But these percentages do not compete overall with the white settler. The United States is still very much a country of European imperialists who are experts in exploitation. No doubt, Black folks in these industries have legitimate grievances against their Jewish colleagues. The powerless dynamic of the colonized, independent of anything else, assures this. Yet it is the paradigm of the colonizer who wishes to colonize undisturbed, without having to admit that he is a white genocidal maniac, without granting restitution and repair to Black people, that helps to give credence to and rectify claims of anti-Semitism to the detriment of Blacks in these industries. The white settler will do anything to place in the distant background his physical, emotional, economic, political, and religious abuse of the Black collective, including faking moral outrage at anti-Semitism. It is collusion against Black people in the same way that liberal politicians collude against Black movements with the police and FBI, deputized Klansmen. Our righteous indignation to industry practices will garner anti-Semitism labels, we know. That, in my opinion, is not the telltale sign of the whiteness extended to and accepted by members of the Jewish community who wish to be in that echelon. It is that once they have accused us of anti-Semitism, the Jewish community enacts white supremacy tactics as punishment for those they deemed guilty of anti-Semitism. The public humiliation, the suspensions, the donations to Jewish-focused charities, demanding that people lose their jobs and livelihood, the forced participation in Jewish cultural sensitivity, coerced apologies, the dropping of contracts, the infantilizing of Black adults, the paternalistic tone, are all akin to a plantation death camp owner dragging a slave to the whipping post and publicly beating him. The whipping post beating satiates the terrorist's barbaric appetite, but the objective of the public flogging is to deliver a visceral message to the colonized who are made to bear witness. This could be you if you dare defy massa. The Jewish community in this way mimics these white settler tactics to perfection. History teaches us that this was not always the case, where Blacks and Jews were adversaries. This may have been when Jews were Jews, before they became white and ascended in class. My colleague, John Jeter, will share his insight into this phenomenon with The Scapegoat: Why the White Settler Blames Blacks for Anti-Semitism, Homophobia, and Everything Under the Sun, the first in an occasional series on America's bizarre, ritualistic scapegoating of Blacks so that the white settler might atone for his sins. If you're not careful, if we may paraphrase Malcolm X, this sick culture will have you hating the oppressed and loving the ones who are doing the oppressing. But before I cede the floor to John, I must co-sign Rock again. Black folks don't have time to subgroup white people, those who continue to revel in Black death in this apartheid state. In the fight for our lives, liberation, and sovereignty, we will just lump them and all their proxies together. I'm Denise Young, Black Republic Media. John?
Thanks, Denise. This is John Jeter for Black Republic Media at blackrepublicmedia.com. As with most political matters, my introduction to the Jews was via my father, Cecil Nathaniel Jeter, the blue-black grandson of a slave and a millwright at Indianapolis Chrysler, who did not, as the saying goes, suffer fools gladly. He loathed Henry Kissinger, and whenever the warlord appeared on the evening news, my father would erupt in a fusillade of invective, calling him everything but a child of God and referencing his Jewishness, although I don't recall him using any of the common slurs. Similarly, he sympathized with Palestinians living under Israeli occupation and voiced his displeasure with Jimmy Carter for pressuring his United Nations ambassador, Andrew Young, to resign in 1979, simply for his back-channel communication with the Palestine Liberation Organization. But it would be a stretch to say that my old man was an anti-Semite. I don't ever recall him gaslighting the Holocaust or referring to Hitler as anything but a monster. He envied how close-knit the Jewish community was and wished for African Americans the same level of solidarity. And he admired the ferocity of radical Jewish activists, such as the civil rights lawyer William Kunstler, who defended the inmates involved in the Attica uprising, Assata Shakur, an activist with the American Indian movement. And then there was the matter of my father's deep affection for our family's Jewish pediatrician, Dr. Bertram Roth, who overlooked it when my father couldn't afford his health plan's copay. I remember Dr. Roth going so far as to scold his secretary for dunning my father about a past due bill, explaining to her that he and, quote, Mr. Jeter had an arrangement, end quote. Even as a child, I could sense my father's respect for Dr. Roth. Sometimes the two men would laugh and banter on for 15 minutes after Dr. Roth had finished looking me over. And I remember specifically one conversation when my father jokingly asked Dr. Roth when he was going to follow his white neighbors who had left the city for the suburbs. The unspoken subtext being the influx of Blacks in the post-civil rights generation who were buying homes in neighborhoods previously reserved for whites. The house still works, Cecil, I remember Dr. Roth saying to my father with a knowing smile. I'm not going anywhere. I swear my father swooned like a schoolgirl. All of which is to say that my father did not hate the Jews, but rather he hated some Jews, just as he hated some Catholics and some Italians and even some African Americans. Rabbi Joseph B. Glazer was of the same generation as my father and Dr. Roth.
He was born to lower middle class Jewish parents in Boston and in 1925.
This is Jack Glazer, Rabbi Glazer's son and a social psychologist at the University of California at Berkeley.
So my father, basically he went into the army as soon as he turned 18 in 1943. So he went into combat. Saw over a year of combat in the infantry as a first scout in the infantry and got 2 Purple Hearts and you know, had a pretty traumatizing experience, and clearly had PTSD in later life, had a very strong startle reflex. He self-medicated with alcohol, you know, several stiff drinks every evening. And but you know, considering what he'd been through, having had to kill people and having his whole platoon got wiped out 3 times over, except for him and the sergeant who was his best friend Jack, who I'm named after, Jack Cowan.
Oh, it's a great story. I mean,
Oh,
poignant story. That's a
I
great
know
story.
it's really remarkable.
Did he ever talk about it?
He talked about it with me. You know, I'm the youngest of his 4 children, and he sort of mellowed. I'm the youngest by quite a bit, and so he kind of mellowed by the time I was coming of age, and so he told me quite a bit. He had not told my siblings much, and it sounds like it was just horrific. Uh, you know, he woke up one morning. He had passed out in a foxhole, and he woke up one morning, and everyone around him was dead.
Oh my God.
He got severe frostbite and almost had to have his feet amputated. And actually, so that sort of segues us to the next phase of his story, which is that his doctors told him that he had to move to a warm climate. He was born in Boston, but they were living in Rochester, New York when he left for the army. And
that's not warm.
that is not warm. And so he applied to UCLA, only UCLA, got rejected. And his father said, "They've made a mistake. You're a star student, and you're a decorated veteran, and you go out there and tell them they've made a mistake." And he put him on a plane to LA, where my grandfather's sister Kitty was living, and so he stayed with his Aunt Kitty. And he went into the admissions office, and you know, the way he told me the story was that the admissions officer said, "Well, let me go check. I'll see." And went into some back office and shuffled some papers and came back and probably just took mercy on him and said, "Yeah, there's been a mistake here." Yeah, so he went, and that was 1946, and
Right after the war.
yeah, right after the war. I mean, he was actually, I just found his papers. He was discharged in March of 46. And so I'm not sure. I think he was writing for the Stars and Stripes. After his injuries, he couldn't go back into combat, but they had him writing for the Stars and Stripes or something. Or and so then he went to UCLA and he graduated in like 2.5 years or something.
Wow.
And then went to Stanford Law School, where he was failing out, and he transferred to USF, University of San Francisco Law School. And that's where he met Howard Thurman.
Like my father, Howard Thurman was the grandson of a slave. Born in Daytona Beach, Florida in 1899, he was a preacher, theologian, and prolific author. In 1944, Thurman co-founded San Francisco's Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples, the first integrated interfaith religious congregation in the United States. And in 1953, he became the first Black dean at a mostly white university, Boston University's Marsh Chapel. One of his proteges was a young Martin Luther King Jr., whose philosophy on nonviolence was greatly influenced by Thurman's 1934 meeting with Mahatma K. Gandhi.
So Howard was in San Francisco and was involved in USF. I think his institute was at USF. And
yeah,
later,
I just read that. Yeah, it was at USF. That's right.
It was later moved to Boston University, I think.
And USF is a
Jesuit.
Yeah, Jesuit. Yeah, I knew it was. I knew it was one of the orders. Yeah.
But my understanding is that Howard was a Baptist minister, and so they. I don't know the details of how they met or how they became so fond of each other, but the story I heard from my dad was basically that he wanted to follow Howard. He wanted to be Howard's apprentice.
Wow.
And he didn't quite know how to make that work, and he contemplated becoming a Unitarian minister. But Howard and Rabbi Mike Heller at Temple Emmanuel, where my dad was confirmation class teacher, and my mother, by the way, he met her at Temple Emmanuel, and she was like the religious Sunday school teacher. And she is a Holocaust survivor who came over in 1940 when she was 12 from Germany,
Oh
and
my
her
God.
parents were both killed in Auschwitz. And she was adopted by a young couple in San Francisco and brought up here, and they happened to meet at Temple Emmanuel. So it's really quite remarkable that
Wow.
this orphaned Holocaust survivor, meets this
Right.
Army veteran, aspiring civil rights, fighter.
Right.
He got his law degree from USF, and he became, but somewhere in there, he got very close to Howard, and like I said, he flirted with becoming a Unitarian minister. I found the pamphlet for the Unitarian seminary, and Howard and Rabbi Heller convinced him to become a rabbi because he was a Jew.
Right.
And
Right. Right.
yeah, and so
Something linear about that logic, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's pretty interesting because in retrospect, it would have been just fine had he left the faith and done all the work that he did in some other capacity, but
Right.
but it worked out very well because, as it turned out, he rose through the ranks of Jewish leadership very quickly and found himself, so getting I guess he got his divinity degree around 1956,
Wow.
and by 1971 he was the top Reform rabbi in the world. Interestingly, my dad didn't do a lot of work on anti-Semitism. His work was very focused on other groups, and he did have a period in the 1960s when he was the Pacific regional director for the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which is the congregational movement of the Reform movement. And then he became the head of the rabbinical wing of the Reform movement. But when he was in the Pacific region, he he went on a visit to Germany to and I found a lot of documentation on this too, as part of sort of an investigative team to see if Germany had turned a corner after the Holocaust. And he wrote a pretty scathing critical report, because one of his experiences was being brought into a school, and when he came into the schoolmaster, stood up, and all the kids jumped to attention and stood there like soldiers, and they told him afterward, isn't it impressive how disciplined our kids are? And he said, no, you guys have missed the point entirely.
Right.
It's
Right.
not about obedience to authority,
Right.
So
Wow.
he wrote a really scathing assessment of that. But then he moved on. He really didn't deal much with Germany and the like. He was much more interested in Israeli-Arab relations and in farm workers' rights and Native American rights, but mostly in African American concerns. He was especially proud of his work with Cesar Chavez, and I have a letter here from Arturo Rodriguez, who is Cesar's son-in-law, who is his successor as the president of the United Farm Workers.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember Arturo came to my father's memorial service and spoke really beautifully. But this is a letter dated on the occasion of my father's retirement from his big job in New York in '94. Dear Rabbi Joseph Glazer, on behalf of the United Farm Workers, we wish to honor your tremendous contribution to the struggle for justice for farm workers. We will always remember your efforts as a young rabbi in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1960s to bring critical early support to our young movement, headed by a person who very few people knew about, Cesar Chavez. When the growers and teamsters were determined to crush the farm workers' desires to have basic human rights, Cesar turned to you, Rabbi, as a person who could gain respect and had the personal integrity to handle all parties and mediate successfully. As the UFW grew and became more successful, so did the battles we had to fight. When national leadership was required among the religious community in the 1970s, and to this day, you have been there. So it goes on, but that's the core of it.
That's
And
amazing.
he was down there, and he went down to Mexicali when the growers were burning crosses to intimidate the farm workers, and he was there with them, and then he helped them negotiate their first contract. he was hand in hand with Cesar Chavez, and there is some documentation. There's a book about sort of David and Goliath battles. One chapter is on Cesar Chavez, and it discusses my father's part. And he was actually sort of a standout among the religious leaders who were trying to help and encouraging a more aggressive stance in support of the farm workers. Yeah.
Right.
He was a tough guy.
Yeah. It sounds like it.
He was a fighter. I remembered he had made reference to this, that he had started up something called the Freedom Writers, which I know there's a movie called The Freedom Writers, with Hilary Swank and all, but in the early 60s, and I have some documentation from 1961, he had started as, I don't know what, I think he was in California, and he probably wished that he could have been the kind of person who was going down to the Deep South to actually, fight on the front lines, but for whatever reason, maybe because he had 3 small children at the time, wasn't ready to go. But he started up this program called the Freedom Writers, where he would have people, religious leaders and others, writing to editors and publishing op-eds and the like about the civil rights movement. Yeah, he made a lot of good trouble. Yeah. Yeah, and then he worked with the Lakota Indians he was an early advocate for getting Leonard Peltier released, and did some of that work. He was an early ally to the Dalai Lama during the Tibetan freedom case, and I found we knew about that, and we have these beautiful pictures of him with the Dalai Lama from back when the Dalai Lama first came to New York and sought out Jewish expertise on how a people can live in a diaspora, because the Tibetans had been kicked out of Tibet.
I never knew that.
He sought them out, and they kind of hit it off, and which is unusual. The Dalai Lama is not usually like touchy-feely, but he was very. They just hit it off, and I've got these pictures of them kind of hugging. When he was doing this early work in the 60s in San Francisco, just to fill in the history a little more before I get to the Thurman stuff, he was very briefly a pulpit rabbi in Ventura, California literally just for 3 years before he got hired to be in the sort of, administration of the movement, and then moved to San Francisco. And then, as I said, in 71, he got the big job in New York as the head of the rabbinic movement. But while he was in San Francisco, he was really involved in a lot of interfaith work, and was involved in something I hadn't heard about, which is the steering committee of San Francisco Religion and Race Conference. And it was a conference at first, and then it became an organization where they were bringing together different interfaith leaders from various faiths to work on racial justice. This conference was May of 1963.
Oh wow!
Yeah, he later on became the chairman of something called Religion in American Life, which was a big national interfaith group. And actually, interestingly, this is really interesting. He's the one who kept out Jim Jones, when other people wanted to include him in Religion in American Life, and he saw a nut job when he knew one. And he also was the sort of main advocate in favor of including Muslim leaders in Religion in American Life when some of the Christian leaders weren't comfortable doing that. And so he was the Jew advocating for the Muslims. Got this beautiful photograph of Thurman signed to my friend Joe Glazer. But I've got some nice correspondence, and there's some lovely correspondence between my dad and his wife Sue and his daughter Anne. They continue to run the Thurman Trust.
So they were really close. I mean, they were corresponding with each other's families.
Yeah. No, I mean, let me read you this a little bit from this card. So Sue, his wife, there's no date, unfortunately, but she sent my parents a Passover greeting card. and it says, Joe and Agatha, dear friends, the events in Boston and having a longer time to be with you personally and in the groups together sorry, your handwriting is beautiful, but very small. Have brightened my year. I see Agatha, that's my mother, so warm and attractive in candle lighting, sitting across the table from guests to whom she was the genial hostess. And of course, you, Joe, made such a fine contribution in your statement at the meeting house and the concert with narrative readings of Howard on Sunday night. I will always love you as one of Howard's best loved sons. He must have conveyed his pleasure in the being that you are, the inner you. And I promise all cards will come on time next year with warmest and best good wishes, Sue. This is dated July 1955, so my father's about to go into the seminary.
Mm-hmm.
So he writes, Dear Joe, on a hot July day in Boston, it would be a completely irrational undertaking for me to say anything to you about how I prepare sermons. We shall talk about it when I see you. I think he must have asked him for advice on sermons. I returned from California on Monday. The weather was perfect, as only San Francisco weather can be. I had 3.5 weeks of the most exacting work of a lifetime. There were many problems at the church, which seemed initially to be insurmountable, but I think now that the sea is less choppy. I tried to see Peggy while out there. As a matter of fact, I went down to Palo Alto, but she was gone for the day. I did have a wonderful visit with Bibbits. I don't know who that is. To speak unconventionally, she is as large as a house, because in a matter of weeks, she will be having the same experience that awaits Agatha. So my mother was about to have my oldest brother.
Okay.
I saw both of the children. Okay. Anyway, so a letter came yesterday from Peggy. She asked me to say to you that your letter was received, and in the course of human events, you will get some word from her. It may be reassuring to you to know that my letter yesterday was the first time I've heard from her in 18 months. But then here's the important part. What you have to say about your thesis and the possibility of exploring the material in terms of their bearing on civil rights is extremely exciting. To be steeped in profound religious insight as the dynamics for effective work in the area of civil rights would put you in a position of unrivaled religious leadership in American life. Man, this is something to consider. And then he goes on to thank him for some words that he had said anyway. But that paragraph is really the crux of it, that they had been talking about how he could use his religious studies to engage in civil rights.
While it was seldom said out loud, it was lost on absolutely no one in my father's generation or Rabbi Glazer's that Blacks and Jews, many of them communist, were thick as thieves during the New Deal and civil rights eras that democratized the state and won for the working class a larger financial stake in the United States economy. Why were African Americans and Jews the most radical actors of this nation's most radical era? Both groups have vivid historical memories of suffering, ours at the hands of European settlers in the New World, and Jews under the thumb of European mobs in the Old. As one illustrative example, a Ku Klux Klan-like outfit known as the Black Hundreds was infamous for nighttime massacres targeting Jewish communities in Tsarist Russia. In fact, the Yiddish word pogrom was invented by Russian Jews to specifically describe these assaults by the Black Hundreds. Alexander III's ascension to the throne in 1881 escalated anti-Semitic violence, causing Russian Jews, including Professor Glazer's grandfather, Rabbi Glazer's father, to flee in droves for enclaves such as New York City. In 1934, a Black Marxist organizer, Harry Haywood, who studied at a Moscow school created by the Bolsheviks to train revolutionaries around the world, said to a mostly Black crowd in Detroit, "Here we have the same sort of race-inciting propaganda which was carried out by the Tsarist regime in old Russia against the Jewish people. The Jews are also branded by the Tsarist reactionaries as killers of Christian children, the blood of whom was used in the ceremonies. This slander against Jews was calculated to inflame the minds of the Russian workers and to justify mass murder of the Jewish people. In this way, the Tsarist reactionaries attempted to divert the attention of the workers from the struggle against their common oppressors. Haywood was among a coterie of organizers with the Communist Party USA, who helped to eventually exonerate the 9 African American teenagers falsely convicted of sexually assaulting 2 white women aboard a train near Scottsboro, Alabama. Among his comrades in that struggle was a Jewish couple, Solomon Auerbach and Ida Kleinman, who first shone a light on the frame up with their reportage published in the communist publication, The Southern Worker, interviewing the boys' families, revealing the young white women to be sex workers, and demanding an end to Jim Crow lynchings. Another Jewish radical who worked on the case was John Howard Lawson, who went on to lead the Hollywood 10, a band of mostly Jewish scriptwriters who were jailed putatively for subversive activities, which in reality included screenplays depicting African Americans as noble in a campaign to shatter racial stereotypes. And when a tax default transferred ownership of the massive Shriners Temple to New York City City Hall in 1942, the mostly Jewish Clothing, Garment, and Musicians Union and a Jewish workers' fraternal organization, the Workmen's Circle, loaned Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia the money to convert the shuttered Midtown Rotunda into the city center for music and drama, which would go on to house the New York City Opera Company. With a top ticket price of only $2, less than a third of what the Metropolitan Opera charged for an orchestra seat at the time, the City Opera Company was an innovator, hiring young American singers who had not yet achieved international reputations. One such artist was Todd Duncan, whose debut in September of 1945 was the first time a major opera company in the United States featured a Black performer in a leading role. 4 years later, the Harlem Renaissance composer William Grant Still premiered his play about the Haitian revolutionary Jean-Jacques Dessalines' Troubled Island, representing the first time a grand opera written by an African American was produced by a major opera house. Gestures like these help explain why African Americans were outspoken supporters of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were executed in 1951 for passing nuclear technology secrets to the Soviet Union. Among their supporters was an interracial couple, Robert Nemiroff, who was Jewish, and Lorraine Hansberry, who was Black, who spent the day before the wedding picketing the Rosenberg's execution outside the federal courthouse in Chicago. Hansberry, who would go on to write the agonizing play A Raisin in the Sun, was described as solemnly reciting her marriage vows, then retreating to a corner to sulk while others celebrated. She wrote later, "We had come to a wedding. We had come to Chicago to lose ourselves in the bridal song. And then there were those moments when the news came, and we spoke of it quietly to one another, our voices soft under the discussion of where the cake would be placed and when the photographers would arrive, our voices above the champagne glasses, our eyes questioning one another between the fresh, fragrant flowers in their gleaming pots on the coffee tables of the wedding house, festive flowers, the Chicago heat in the vast living room, suddenly overpowering the senses, some grim, terrible fire within, suddenly making it more awful, more stifling, the desire to fling the glass into the flowers, to thrust one's arms into the air and run out of the house screaming at one's countrymen to come down out of the apartments, down from the houses, to get up from the television sets, from the dinner tables. The bride sits a moment in a corner alone to herself, she thinks. And what shall I say to my children? And how shall I explain such a thing to them? The Rosenbergs' two sons were adopted by the Jewish songwriter Abel Meeropol, who composed the anti-lynching dirge Strange Fruit, popularized by Billie Holiday. Before turning to a career in music, Meeropol was a high school English teacher in New York City, and among his students was a young James Baldwin. Less well known is the role that an African-American New York City social worker named Evelyn Williams played in the Meeropol's adoption of the Rosenberg boys. Following the Rosenberg's execution, the state wanted to institutionalize the couple's sons to prevent their radicalization by an adopted Jewish family that was sympathetic to the Rosenbergs, which the Meeropols most certainly were. As the lead investigator assigned to the boys' case, Williams found herself pressured by her supervisor to uncover, or failing that, to manufacture, the signs of neglect that would provide child welfare authorities with the pretext to remand the boys to an orphanage. In Williams' autobiography, she wrote, "Before my investigation was complete, Pankin called me into his chambers and threatened to fire me if I did not follow that recommendation. I made a choice to base my decision concerning my future recommendations for the children solely on my own investigative findings, and the hell with the job." Williams would go on to earn a law degree and later defend the Black Liberation Army, which included her niece, Joyce Chesimard, who the world would come to know as Assata Shakur. As adults, the Rosenberg sons would investigate the charges against their parents and conclude that their father likely conspired with his brother-in-law to pass nuclear secrets to the Russians. But the information was not terribly useful, and at best shaved the time it took the Soviet Union to manufacture the bomb from 5 to 4 years. In the worst case scenario, Ethel Rosenberg did nothing more than type up the stolen notes. None of that was of any real concern to the couple's executioners, however. What was paramount to investors and their vassals in Washington, D.C., was driving a wedge through the interracial coalition that was, at that time, giving them fits. It's important to understand that the issue of the Jews' racial identity was very much in question following the Second World War. Remember that Hitler targeted the Jews because he considered them non-white and communist, and that the architects of South African apartheid in 1948 debated the issue robustly before deciding to classify Jews as whites. With the horror of the Holocaust still in everyone's rearview mirror, elites in the United States began to extend the racial contract to Jews, offering them the opportunity to enjoy the same privileges and protections as whites, if only they would agree to unambiguously switch sides in the class war and participate in the white settlers' subjugation of the Negro. Although most Jewish organizations protested the Rosenbergs' conviction, others, most notably the American Jewish Committee, endorsed the verdict in a tacit acknowledgement of the deal they were being offered. By no means did all Jews agree to this deal. Indeed, Howard Zinn was a keeper of the radical faith until the day he died of a heart attack in 2010, as was the attorney William Kunstler, Swerner and Goodman, Martin Luther King's attorney Stanley Levison, a University of Chicago student named Bernie Sanders, Rabbi Glazer, and many others. But it is no accident that the neoconservative movement that flourished in the 1980s was led by Jewish intellectuals such as Nathan Glazer, Milton Himmelfarb, Irving Kristol, Elliot Cohen, Hannah Arendt, Daniel Bell, and perhaps most importantly, the libertarian economist Milton Friedman, who first came to prominence for rushing to the aid of white parents traumatized by the U.S. Supreme Court's 1954 desegregation ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education. By proposing a voucher system that remains the template for school privatization, Friedman's ultimate goal was to offload the cost of public education to working class parents and, chillingly, discourage the poor from having children as part of a eugenics plot, as the scholar Nancy McLean explained in a 2021 paper entitled How Milton Friedman Exploited White Supremacy to Privatize Education. The Black Jewish Coalition reached its breaking point in 1968, however, when African American and Puerto Rican parents in Brooklyn's Ocean Hill and Brownsville neighborhoods proposed that they assume the responsibility for managing their children's public schools. Influenced by Malcolm X's pedagogy of self-reliance, the takeover plan merely acknowledged the failure of white administrators and educators to imbue Black and Brown students with either the knowledge or the confidence they would need to succeed. More than a decade after the Supreme Court's desegregation order, New York City schools were more segregated than ever. Test scores were abysmal, dropout rates high, and classrooms overcrowded. And so it seemed only fair to parents in the Ocean Hill, Brownsville school districts that if the largely white schools bureaucracy could meet the needs of their children, they should do it themselves. With support from New York City Mayor John Lindsay and the Ford Foundation, organizers pitched the idea to New York City's Board of Education, which signed off on the pilot project in July of 1967. Nearly a year later, on May 9, 1968, a 38-year-old science teacher at Junior High School 271 in the Ocean Hill Brownsville district, Fred Nauman, was a few minutes into his first class when he was summoned to the principal's office, where he was handed an envelope. It read, "Dear Sir, the governing board of the Ocean Hill Brownsville Demonstration School District has voted to end your employment in the schools of this district. This action was taken on the recommendation of the Personnel Committee. This termination of employment is to take effect immediately. In the event you wish to question this action, the governing board will receive you on Friday, May 10th, 1968 at 6:00 p.m. at Intermediate School 55, 2021 Bergen Street, Brooklyn, New York. You will report Friday morning to Personnel, 110 Livingston Street, Brooklyn, for reassignment. Sincerely, Reverend C. Herbert Oliver, Chairman, Ocean Hill Brownsville Governing Board, Rhodey A. McCoy, Unit Administrator." A German Jew who arrived in New York with his parents on the eve of World War II, Nauman was one of 19 teachers and administrators who had received the reassignment notice. He was also a chairman for the United Federation of Teachers, or UFT, representing 55,000 public school teachers, a good many of them Jewish. Signing its first union contract in 1961, the UFT was the successor to the more radical teachers union, which had been destroyed in the 1950s by the same communist witch hunts that jailed the Hollywood 10 and murdered the Rosenbergs. Narrowly interpreting community control, as a challenge to their rights won by negotiating a collective bargaining agreement with the city, union leaders such as Naumann and UFT President Albert Shanker, also Jewish, followed Friedman's lead in objecting to the governing board's choices for principals in the Ocean Hill-Brownsville schools, opposing changes in the curriculum to reflect the students' African heritage, and insisting that the community did not have the right to reassign uninspired, underperforming teachers. According to Gerald Poder in his marvelous account, The Strike That Changed New York, Blacks, Whites, and the Ocean Hill-Brownsville Crisis, the project's African-American superintendent, Rhodey McCoy, had begged union leaders to be more flexible. They wouldn't listen. He had told Naumann and his colleagues that this was an experiment in community control. And if this did not mean control over personnel, finances, and curriculum, what did it mean? They didn't understand. The union seemed to go out of its way to throw bureaucratic impediments at him. He was trying to be reasonable, but the white teachers wouldn't meet him halfway. It was as if they didn't respect him. Perhaps that was it. He didn't have proper credentials. Most of the 16 members of the local board were women. Many were on welfare. Naumann and the union didn't think they were professional enough, or maybe they just weren't white enough. Perhaps that was the problem. In any case, a few days before, McCoy and the local board had decided to do something about it. They had met and made a list of the educators in the district who were the most hostile to community control. Naumann was one of them. When the teachers tried to return to their classrooms, they were blocked by hundreds of community residents. On May 15th, 300 police officers escorted the teachers back to schools, breaking the blockade until the schools reopened in the fall of 1968. The United Federation of Teachers led a series of citywide strikes, shutting down New York's public schools for 36 days. The strike ended in November of 1968 when New York State's Education Commissioner took control of the Ocean Hill-Brownsville district and reinstated the dismissed teachers. The damage, however, was lasting, with Jews charging anti-Semitism and Blacks countering with charges of racism. The vanguard of the workers' movement that had begun to dig the nation out of a deep hole almost 40 years earlier at the nadir of the Great Depression was irrevocably split. Few people alive today are familiar with this history, but the lie of Black anti-Semitism has been repeated so often that it has become something of a default narrative for a white settler republic that has neither the intellectual resources or the moral courage to question its veracity. And to hear white people and their Black sock puppets tell it, we are the cause of all that is wrong with this country. After a white gunman killed 5 and injured more than 24 people at a Colorado nightclub last month, NBA Hall of Famer Charles Barkley said in a television interview, "One thing that's always disappointed me, Black people mistreat gay people. We are the worst when it comes to mistreating gay people," Barkley said to CNN. "It's always bothered me. It shouldn't, because Black mistreatment of gays doesn't exist statistically. Research has found that LGBTQ issues are a non-factor for Black voters, and that African Americans support marriage equality at slightly higher rates than the population at large. The mainstream news and entertainment media often ascribes homophobia to devout church-going Blacks, but there is no evidence to substantiate this claim. And anecdotally, my almost 90-year-old mother, Joan Jeter, refutes this stereotype. It is true that she believes that homosexuality is a sin, but it is also true that the organist at virtually every Black church in America is gay and just as welcome at Sunday dinner as is the pastor, who is typically aggressively heterosexual. Far from hating gays, my mother fears for gays' immortal soul. Similarly, the White Settler Project describes Black fathers as deadbeat dads, when a 2007 peer-reviewed study by the sociologist Rebecca Levine Coley found that African American men who don't live in the same home spend more quality time with their children than any other demographic group. And really, does any man in history deserve to be called a deadbeat more than Thomas Jefferson, who not only enslaved his own children, but did not free them even after his death? Black men are portrayed as drug addicts, yet studies show that white men are more likely to use drugs. We are portrayed as rapists, even though the European settler literally raped his way from one end of the New World to the other, from Argentina to Alberta, Canada, creating entirely new categories of humanity. What the hell is a mulatto or an octoroon? How profligate was white rape? Rosa Parks got her start as an activist, helping African American women who have been sexually assaulted by white gangs pursue criminal charges. A recent example that really shines a light on the scapegoating of African Americans is the 21-year-old white gunman who in 2021 murdered 8 people at an Atlanta massage parlor, 6 of whom were Asian women. Said the writer Zed Jelani on the internet news program Rising, there is not a white supremacist wave of terrorism or hate crimes or anything like that. That is, in fact, exactly what is happening, according to the FBI, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and a 2020 study published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which found that right-wing extremists perpetuated 2/3 of the attacks and plots in the United States in 2019, and over 90% between January 1st and May 8th of 2020. And yet, Jelani's interviewer, Crystal Ball, doubled down on Jelani's exoneration of whites, putting the onus on African Americans who are jealous of Asians' success, saying, there is a history of tension sometimes between minority groups, and that's a very uncomfortable conversation to have. You've got people who are poor in largely Black communities who see people coming in and doing somewhat better than they are. In a report published in March of 2021, Columbia University sociologists Jennifer Lee and Tiffany Luang pushed back against the trope of Black-Asian conflict, identifying a strong correlation between xenophobic attacks and white nationalism. Moreover, the sociologist wrote, both Asians and Blacks across the country have worked to mend fences since a Korean merchant was sentenced to probation for fatally shooting a 15-year-old African-American girl, Latasha Harlins, in 1991, helping trigger the Los Angeles riots a year later. Consequently, Asian Americans are among the country's most stalwart supporters of reparations for Blacks, and Blacks are among the first to volunteer to accompany elderly Asians on their errands to help deter racist attacks. Lee and Luang wrote, hence, not only does the frame of two minoritized groups in conflict ignore the role of white national populism, but it also absolves the history and systems of inequality that position them there. Many of the people who decry Kyrie Irving's and Kanye West's anti-Semitism support the neo-Nazi battalions in Ukraine. Nike's founder, Phil Knight, has pocketed tens of millions of dollars exploiting teenage girls in Indonesia and elsewhere in the global South, yet has the audacity to reproach Irving for posting a link to a documentary that repeated some unfortunate anti-Semitic tropes. Ari Emanuel, the Hollywood agent, and brother of Obama BFF and former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, popularly known as Mayor 1%, put Kanye on blast for his remarks, which, in my opinion, reflects the mind of someone who is suffering from mental illness. Yet, the Emanuels are fast friends with former Mayor Richard Daley, who can be seen in the crowd at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, shouting at U.S. Senator Abraham Ribicoff to get off the stage after he denounced the Chicago Police Department's violent handling of peaceful protesters. You needn't be a lip reader to ascertain the choice epithets the Daleys hurled at Ribicoff, who was Jewish. You see, it truly is the case, as George Bernard Shaw once wrote, that all criticism is a form of autobiography. The criticisms leveled against Kyrie Irving and Kanye West are at once projection and a means of isolating the most radical actors in American history, Black folks. And with apologies to Mark Twain, history doesn't just rhyme, it does repeat. Consider the recent scandal involving the Latino Los Angeles City Council members and union leader. Similar to Naumann and Shanker and Friedman before them, their racist remarks represent a kind of application or audition to be white in the club, protected, prosperous, and safe. You see, to borrow the comedian Dave Chappelle's explanation offered during his monologue in his Netflix special, The Closer, Blacks don't have a problem with gays, nor by extension Asians or Jews. We have a problem with white people who have been our tormentors more or less for 400 years and counting. This is John Jeter for Black Republic Media. Let's let James Baldwin have the last word.
Well, I know this. Anyone who's ever tried to live knows this. So what you say about somebody else, anybody else, reveals you. What I think of you as being is dictated by my own necessities, my own psychology, my own fears and desires. I'm not describing you when I talk about you. I'm describing me. Now here in this country we've got something called a nigger. It doesn't in such terms, I beg you to remark, exist in any other country in the world. We have invented the nigger. I didn't invent him. White people invented him. I've always known, I had to know by the time I was 17 years old, what you were describing was not me, and what you were afraid of was not me. It had to be something else. You had invented it, so it had to be something you were afraid of. And you invested me with it. Now, if that's so, no matter what you've done to me, I can say to you this, and I mean it. I know you can't do any more, and I've got nothing to lose. And I know, and I've always known, and really always, that's part of the agony. I've always known that I'm not a nigger. But if I am not the nigger, and if it's true that your invention reveals you, then who is the nigger? I am not the victim here. I know one thing from another. And I know I'm going to born and I'm going to be, I was born, I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to die. And the only way you get through life is to know the worst things about it. I know that a person is more important than anything else. Anything else. I learned this because I've had to learn it. But you still think, I gather, that the nigger is necessary. Well, he's unnecessary to me, so he must be necessary to you. So I give you your problem back. You're the nigger, baby, he isn't me.
Black Republic Media, a sovereign narrative, a mighty race.
You're listening to Black Republic Media, America's bizarre, ritualistic scapegoating of blacks series. Part 1, The Scapegoat. Why the white settler blames blacks for anti-Semitism, homophobia, and everything under the sun. Thursday, December 8, 2022.